uh, why is it so substantial? And it's because it actually does derive out into a metapolitics. And in other words, we don't have to be Democrats and in a sense of like idolizing Joe Biden or some other Democratic figure, or maybe somebody in Europe, maybe, or or a Republican in the same way. We can just sort of like realize, well, there's just like there's really a metapolitics that controls all of this, and what's substantial about what's substantial in thinking about politics is deriving a metapolitics that kind of makes sense of the whole charade, so to speak. That's what came to mind when you were talking about that. Yeah, is that my interest in my sort of like subsuming politics with metapolitics.
And is there something that radically changes when you go from the individual level to the communal level, or do you see them as parallel social structures, conscious structures?
Well, all those things are both individual and community. I mean, everything has a universal side. I think that's what I'm grasping much more strongly now about Hegel. Is everything has the universal side and the particular, and so in trying to find out trying to discover the substantial, you become aware of the universal, and the universal is always not what the substantial is. It's just simply the perfection of the unity as it is. In other words, the unity in existence. And that to me is the best way to take Hegel. Everything exists as a in process towards substance, towards unity, and essentially disintegrating itself into a universal of some kind. Either he talks about, that's where I really get a little confused. That's where I sort of got bogged down in Force, because he's always talking about the unconditioned universal, either an unconditioned universal or unconditionally universal. And that's kind of like a little bit difficult for me. But on the other hand, I love that division, constant tendency of things to divide both into a particular thing for itself, and then beyond that, there's always a thing for another as existing, and I think that's where you have the interplay of forces, and where the philosophy really becomes concrete as a methodology of thinking, and can be applied much more widely, even than the story about spirit, the story about philosophy, the story about absolute spirit, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, for the modern person, I mean, the universal is a abstract. I think, it doesn't have a ontological foundation. But for Hegel, it appears to me quite strongly that it has a platonic reality. It's actually a realm somewhere. So when it seems to me, I mean, and I've got my hard copy now, the only pink version of the Phenomenology of Spirit, in the world. It seems to me that he's talking about some, absolute realm that really exists, that we could, substitute the word God for very easily. So when we're talking about, consciousness, I mean, I think I have to distinguish between the universal, consciousness of Hegel, which is a pseudonym for God, it seems, and consciousness of, a society, and consciousness in general, and self-consciousness. I mean, there's different, levels there, some of which the absolute level, I think, is which Hegel upholds, I believe is very hard, or perhaps impossible to uphold in modern thought.
Liz has her hand up. I'd like to hear what she has to say.
Okay. Well, I put my hand up at a time when you're talking about the master slave relationship. So this may seem off topic, but it would seem to me that in real life, in the BDSM game, that masters and slaves quite often switch their places, and the slave becomes the master, and the master really has a desire to be the slave. So it would seem to me that maybe the reason the master is unhappy is that secretly he could have a desire to be the slave, and maybe he feels guilty too for being the master, for being too hard to the slave. So he really wants to be a slave and not to have any responsibilities, to have somebody else thinking for him.
Yeah, that's good. George.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Liz said something that I thought was very good and very interesting. I don't think there's so much as guilt over being the master over the slave. The idea that he is the master and he's not happy, right? So to extrapolate just a little bit further on this, right? How many billionaires, how many millionaires are unhappy? And maybe one has to ponder just from a philosophical perspective, what really compounds or amplifies their unhappiness, which is the idea, I'm a billionaire, I'm a millionaire, I should be happy, I'm not. How much of that, feeds in, how much of that is there, right? And now I'm going off on a little bit, but I'm not going to talk about something. I'm just going to throw it out as an idea. Wealth addiction, something else altogether. I just wanted to make that point.
Cool. How about that news article about Jeff Bezos's ex-wife just got married, right? So I think that was it. She just got married again. Just got remarried, and it's kind of like really interesting news. There was, I forget the circumstances, like who she got married to, but it was kind of interesting.
Got married to
somebody like a professor,
one of her kids' high schools,
like a high school teacher. So it's clearly not about material success and happiness that she is searching for. So the question of how the material world satisfies your desires, the material world I don't see that there's much value in the material world per se. It's about what it's doing, what you're doing with it that really matters, because she's dedicated herself to philanthropy, which is along the lines of what he's talking about. It's like the actions that are expressed in the world. That's you acting, and that's not something that a master does. It's something the master makes the slave do. So here she wants the satisfaction of directing her power and resources and shaping the world. So she's interested in taking her desires and making them objective by materially affecting the world. As far as the universal, Derek, I think the word universal applies at all levels of consciousness, and it means something sort of different in each one, although its general idea is what we're used to thinking of universals meaning. But if you think of universals in Hegel, the now is a universal. So it's not a single sensation. It's the placeholder that's open for any sensation to be placed in. So it's a generalization of something. And when we get notions, we're always generalizing. So we've always universalized. And, we want to match the particular to the universal by saying, I have this goal, and making an object for a specific object that is that universal realized as actual. So, but you're right. And when you talk about absolute in the spirit, what that is a particular thing in Hegel, that's way beyond my pay grade.
But what I see now is that we do have there's a really interesting comment from Lucas in the chat. I love that. Thank you, Lucas. So there's this unfolding that's happening in the society. There's almost a Hegelian unfolding that's going on to a certain extent on YouTube. Just if you have the Hegel flag up in YouTube, you get some really interesting videos. And I happen to have YouTube Premium, so I can stand to watch everything since it doesn't have any commercials. But so I can watch long videos without commercials. But including lectures and things like that. So the universal, in a sense, is beginning to unfold in society, even if it were not for Hegel, or maybe partly because due to Hegel. But if you actually watch media, you're aware of Netflix and all of its competition from Apple and all those other companies, you realize, wow, there is an unfolding of a universal going on here. Something that's beyond any the control of any one artist. This is similar to like the late 19th century in music, where you had like it was like this kind of like rush, or in the beginning of the 20th century, this big rush to redefine music and to create new forms of music and so forth, and that existed through the 20th century pretty much. And you have that now in drama and video and things like that. And it's kind of like, wow, why is the world like rushing towards representing itself at such a frenetic, I got your disease, Derek, sorry, frenetic pace.
Right, because reason wants to fully comprehend itself. Yeah, and so, right, if it hasn't figured it out yet, it has to keep displaying it until all those questions are assimilated and clear. So we need really good categorical thinking and the ability to bring opposing notions together. And there certainly are these echo chambers that don't come together. So that heightens the tension and the voltage and makes it maybe potentially, there's a way to connect them and make the system healthier.
Just keep listening to NPR, David.
That's no fair. That's all I listen to. No,
because that's kind of the mission of NPR. NPR is trying to like put it all together for us, not make it sound like they're following the latest firecracker, but the firecrackers are still there, but they're trying to make it all look like what's actually going on outside the window,
I think it's all pre-washed though.
It is pre-washed. Yeah.
Yeah, so you never get the raw. Not much anyway. So do you see the competition as a universalization, or?
Oh, you mean the competition in media? Yeah. This is kind of like, and there's like, and there are forces in society that are kind of like nuts about it. In other words, the anti-social media crowd, the idea that politics has to fix social media. And I understand, like, there's commercial concerns and things like that, but and occasionally there are ethical concerns. There are sexual exploitation sites. There are suicide encouragement sites, things like that. So, but you need to, but the idea that you have a kind of like a replenishment of ideas, both good and bad, is not really a bad idea, because it's always going to occur, and it always did occur before. I can't tell you how many people that I met in my life who were obvious Nazis or supremacists. Part of the problem is I was married to a Chilean woman, and I spent vacations in Chile, and you would go out in the street and you'd meet a neighbor and you'd find out that they were a Nazi. They attended meetings, and they were actually Nazis working to bring down the liberal government, the new liberal government, because at one time Chile was under a military dictatorship. So, 1970s, partly because of us. Go ahead, George.
George?
George, you got your hand up.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Then Derek,
No,
then Derek.
I had a discussion yesterday, a very long 2-hour discussion with these scientists, and they approach the world vis-a-vis analytic philosophy, which is to say material realism. Only the 4 dimensions exist. And part of the problem I was having with the conversation with them was that they don't realize that they're defining knowledge in a way that's tautological, right? So only material reality exists. So when you say, well, what about this? What about that? Well, only material reality exists. And so, I'm talking about all these phenomenon that are beyond material reality. And so, moreover, we even came to the question of, well, let me just say this. I'm sorry, before I go on, let me say this. For Hegel, someone said, are spirits real for Hegel? Absolutely. As a matter of fact, it's important to know. Again, I don't know. This is the first time I've actually joined this group and talking to you guys. But for Hegel, it's the spirit of gravity. It's the spirit of conservation. It's the spirit of thermodynamics. It's the spirit of love. It's the spirit of greed, right? So, the physical sciences and the social sciences, or those aspects of liberal arts that deal with human affairs, they are of one piece. Of course, the physical sciences are more obviously precise, clearly more measurable, but ontologically, they're the same, right? And so, when Hegel speaks of the universal, part of what he's doing is making the empirical case. He says, look how we see monarchy, right? We see it in Europe, we see it in China, we see it in Japan. Look how we see government, right? These are generalizable phenomenon, right? And so here we're speaking of universals, government and family, right? This is replicated across time and space. So, this is the interaction with the absolute. This is the interaction with the 5th dimension, right? And so Hegel is making an argument for the supersensible, right? That which we cannot touch, but also saying that the only way we can really understand humanity, the only way we can really understand ourselves is by making direct reference to the supersensible, right? The point I was going to make about the physical scientists was that we started talking about theories of the human mind. Again, I'm just going to end on this note with you guys. I'm going to cede the floor. We started talking about the questions of the human mind. And then they're like, well, we're going to be able to explain the human mind over the next 30 or 40 years, which of course I said, that's a dogma. First and foremost, that's a dogma. Secondly, the point that I made to them was that, matter and energy ontologically are profoundly different than the question of human consciousness, right? So, the only point the reason I raised this is because to leave it to the physical sciences, right, they would essentially negate, right? I would submit that they negate the human mind. I would submit that they negate the human experience, right? Because they are, by definition, only looking for answers in material reality. Again, I'm going on a bit of a tangent because I'm still in the spin from that 2-hour conversation yesterday with those scientists that make these broad philosophical claim, right? And they're very dogmatic and even authoritarian about it. So I'm still left with the vestiges of that emotional pollution. But anyway, I hope my comments help the conversation in some way or other. I'm sorry, I cede the floor. I'm sorry for speaking so long.
Well, that's great, George. I appreciate your comments. I'll let Derek. I want to get back to that subject, though. That was great, of the bringing in the contrast with analytic philosophy. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, we were talking about the unhappy consciousness, and of course, I've just been reading a little about it in Hegel on page 119. But concerning George's point, I feel that perhaps science might have more in common with Hegel than we might think, because what I'm concerned about with Hegel is that he has a notion of consciousness, of things working out, but it's not only something that's working out in human life, it's something that's working out in the whole of the cosmos. And I find this a bit disconcerting that he's bringing up a principle that's operating through the whole of the cosmos. A lot of people get things out of this, like Nietzsche's, a will to power is a similar kind of idea. He uses the will to power as a explanatory, a principle of all life and all chemical interaction to some extent, not just a human life. So I'm concerned with Hegel's a projection, as I see it, of this principle into the cosmos. And when we say, okay, there are instances of things working out in society, well, I mean, Hegel would agree with us, but they are. But are they the same kind of things that that Hegel was talking about, or we are simply, imposing these things that we find in society on Hegel's thinking?
Well, I mean, I think the idea that when you look at feudalism in Japan versus feudalism in Western Europe, I mean, we're really imposing things. I mean, they're very similar. They're very, very similar, right? Or when you look at feudalism and hierarchy amongst the Aztecs or amongst the Indians, amongst the Incas, right? I mean, it's very comparable and it's very like phenomenon, right? So I don't think anyone's a Hegelian. I don't think Hegelians were the ones that came up with the idea, well, look, you're seeing similar types of social structures and similar politics being replicated around the world at roughly the same time. I don't think it's Hegelians that are coming to this conclusion, right? I think it's observers that are saying, look, here you have, in Hawaii, you have peonage at the same time as you had peonage in Europe, or you had peonage in Japan, right? I don't think that this is a function of Hegelians looking for support. I think it's the opposite. I think Hegel is saying, look, isn't this interesting how we're seeing this phenomenon replicated throughout time and space? Doesn't this really tell us something about metaphysics?
Right. And so I have my hands up. I'll respond to George. I think that that's part of his phenomenology, is saying, and here's what it looks like from within that context. Do you see these elements in here? This is how they're playing out. And then, you say, well, does that apply to this form of feudal life? Does that apply to this form of membership in a political community? So he's really doing what would it be called? When not a philology. When you lay out, well, I see animals, and some have wings, and some are short and stocky, and some can barely fly, but some crawl, and they this. He's categorizing forms that he observes and seeing how, well, this one can't come about without some prior forms. So he's sort of doing an evolutionary exploration and trying to give it a force of necessity by saying, this can't have happened without this. As opposed to saying, well, I'll predict what's next. It's more helpful to see how does it fit together as an energetic system. And as far as, a single thing explaining the whole universe, if you're a scientist, you use cause and effect will explain your whole universe, or the principle of least action will be what every principle reduces to, and that's your view of things. And I don't know that there's one view like that in Hegel, as much as, well, there are rocks and there's consciousness, and consciousness can take these different shapes. And when a consciousness meets a consciousness, there are only so many things that can happen. And then there's a community of consciousnesses, and that's as far as I go, because that's all I've got.
Let me speak to this quite. Actually, the whole debate I had yesterday was really centered around evolution. And unfortunately, I actually have a, if I could just comment, I have a talk.
What was yesterday? What was it?
It was on intelligent design. It was like the Austin group and this and that. It was all on intelligent design. Okay. And so as a matter of fact, I have my own meetup that I'm hosting this Friday. I'll put it up in the chat about Star Trek and the metaphysics debate. And I use popular culture as empiricism. So as a sort of empirical judicator, I like to use popular culture in my writing. And I'm very high on Star Trek as a source of philosophical knowledge. Indeed, what I'll say is that my read of the political canon, political theory canon, is Hegel, Marx, Star Trek. So Star Trek brings Hegel and Marx into the 20th and 21st centuries. That's my read of the political theory canon. But so in any event, the conversation yesterday was primarily about evolution. And one of the unfortunate things, and this is the point that I'm going to make in my conversation on Friday, is a point I'm making in my literature, is that one of the big mistakes that humanity has made from a philosophical, political point of view is that the metaphysics debate, popularly conceived, is that between atheism, or what passes for atheism, and analytic philosophy on the one hand versus religious epistemology on the other. So in the popular mind, there's two broad conceptions of metaphysics. Again, either it's material realism, aka analytic philosophy, or it's religious epistemology. So one of the problems I was finding, and again, I talk about this and say, look, the third way, the accurate way is Hegel. It's Hegelian metaphysics. This is the way you should be conceptualizing the world vis-a-vis Hegelian metaphysics. And so I argue that Star Trek, one of the values of Star Trek is that, it demonstrates the popularity of Hegelian metaphysics because Star Trek is predicated on Hegelian metaphysics. In any event, going back to evolution very quickly, the issue that I had yesterday, and of course I'm arguing pure Hegel here, no doubt, is that the evolutionary process can only be understood as an interaction between genes, let's just say DNA, and the Hegelian absolute. And so, you think about the very notion of life. You think about you think about the will to survive, the will to procreate, right? And these are functions of the absolute, I would argue. And it's an interaction again between the absolute and reality, right? And of course, they and I said, look, at the core of evolution is the will to survive. And so, you can't understand the evolutionary process without understanding the will to survive. Well, they got very insulting. Oh, you don't understand evolution. You're ignorant. Oh, the evolutionary, there's no gap in the fossil record. Even though, of course, they can't explain consciousness just by way. They can't explain again life itself, how life is born of simply inanimate objects, right? They can't understand any of that, right? But that's the whole point. Yes, that there's, the one thing I say about evolutionary process is that, and this sort of struck me as a conclusion. I was in Colombia a couple of weeks ago, and I was in their botanical garden, and I was sitting there, and they're giving us a tour of this garden, and they showed us this broadleaf tree. Okay, it's just a green broadleaf tree, but it has a unique defense mechanism, which is that it looks diseased. It's not diseased, but it looks diseased. It has holes in it, and in a sort of non-random way. And so the interpretation of that leaf is that this is a defense mechanism that grazers won't touch the leaf because they think that it's diseased. The other thing is that the other advantage is that those holes allow for light and water to reach, the lower parts of the tree, of this bush or whatever it is. And it struck me at that moment, and again, I'm a Hegelian, so it's not new in and of itself, but it does strike me that there is an active creativity, an inventiveness that we're seeing in nature, right? That we're not simply seeing the random interaction of matter and energy. We would never get this kind of creativity, intelligence, if you will. I hate that phrase intelligent design because it's so tainted, right? In other words, again, this is the problem that we have in society, is that anytime you start to argue for anything beyond simply material again, four dimensions, all of a sudden you're accused of invoking religion. And you're accused of it in a very insulting way. And so I found myself many, many times saying, hey, I'm an atheist, right? The Hegelian absolute operates rationally. Religion is irrational in that context because it presupposes an entity just sort of randomly intervening itself into this rational process of the ontology and the processes of the absolute, right? But with that said, I'm sorry, you guys, other people have their hands up. James has his hand up. Sorry to go on.
David, did you have a specific refutation in mind, or you want, because James, I and Derek have our hands up.
No, I hope, think about this, James. I hope there's some way we can, while someone's talking, just interrupt and say, what does that mean? Just, can you help? Because I did have, for example, George was saying Star Trek is Hegelian in some way. I was just wondering a little clarification, as you were saying it, because then I got sort of tied up and, wow. So how do you, I would have asked, how did you see that? In what way were you saying that was essential or something?
Okay, well, the Star Trek text is very dense and very thick. Okay, but I'll give you one episode. And this is the episode that I suggest that there's a direct reference to Hegel. Again, it's an interpretation, it's stylized. It's more philosophy than it is a direct reference to Hegel. In the show Sacred Ground, the episode Sacred Ground, and this is in the Star Trek Voyager platform. There's an episode where they come across this planet where they have something that is sort of their deities. It's called the ancestral spirits. Of course, again, Hegel spoke of spirits. And so what happens is one of the crew members basically goes into this forbidden area and runs into some kind of what was deemed a force field. And then she lapses into a coma. Now, what's interesting is that the monks, so-called monks there, that can walk through that field quite freely. But when she tried to walk through it, she got rendered into a coma and on the verge of death. And so then the captain says, okay, I'm going to figure this out in terms of analytic philosophy. I'm going to go here. I'm going to measure this field. I'm going to understand its dimensions. I'm going to understand the science underlying this field. And then I'm going to be able to save the crewmate. So then she then goes down to the planet trying to figure out this field, and she interacts with the monks. And in the end, what the denouement of the episode is that only when she accepts the idea that there is something beyond material reality, only then can she walk through the field safely and take her crew member with her. Now, there's a couple of instances there that, again, I think are very overtly Hegelian. So, for instance, at one point, now you might disagree with me, someone says to her, it would be great for you if you could measure this, touch it, measure it with your instruments. Wouldn't that be very absolute? Right? So I do that as, okay, is that a veiled reference to Hegel? Then the other question is, they say to her, there you go again, the real is relative. The real is relative. Again, I took it as a very clear statement of Hegelian.
Thanks. That was helpful.
So whatever. In other words, I'm going to send you the link. It's the reading is a very short 8 pages. You don't even have to go. You can just read the document. It's written by me, and I'll do that right now as we talk.
Thank you, George. I'll go before next because I had my hand up. I beat Derek to the draw this time. So I think a video I saw on animals this week. It was the tufted squirrels of northern Sweden. So these cutest animals on the planet, kind of thing. They're red and they tufts on top of their ears to help keep their ears warm. And I, after seeing the video, I don't even know if I watched the whole video. I just got a good look on at these tufted squirrels and their life in 30 degrees below 0 centigrade. And what's going on there? And I thought about the tufts. And the one thing that I don't agree with that might have made so many people angry at the intelligent design meeting was the use of the word intelligence. In other words, intelligence is kind of like a, what do you call that? It's a trigger word, right? So for atheists and for evolutionary scientists, and my idea of these tufted squirrels is that those ear tufts each squirrel comes out with his own design for the ear tufts. In other words, they're a little bit like humans. You ever notice how different humans look from each other? And it's difficult to sort of like, design one human look for everyone. There's like some guys that look like Robert Redford, I'm sure, but there's also a lot of guys that look like me and a lot of good guys that look like, well, David, you look a little bit like Robert Redford, but and everybody has like a different kind of like pattern to their facial markings and different aspects of their bodies. Yeah, I don't want to get into that stuff, but these tufted squirrels are in these extreme conditions and they develop ear coverings like extreme exaggerations of the hair around their ears in order to make sure that that part of their body doesn't freeze while they're out in the air in the middle of winter having a munch. And because that's what most of the pictures in the video were about, was these tufted squirrels out having a munch in this while the snow is falling. So, and I thought about all the squirrels that wouldn't make it, because that's what evolution is really all about. It's not about this like kind of like intelligence of nature, but the fact that nature is a filter, and out of the filter, there's a survival of some species, and the species are always evolving. They're getting prettier and bigger and better tufts of hair, stronger, more resistant to the weather around their ears or for whatever purpose those tufts are there. And the birds are getting fancier in order to attract mates. I
understand. You don't have to get into it. I know what your argument is, but I don't know. Does Derek have something to say? I do want to respond to that.
Well, I mean, there's not a thinker. There's not a thinker behind that. What that is a DNA process that causes changes in the traits which sponsor survival.
No, I understand your point. I understand. What I'm going to say to you is this, okay, is that the process doesn't work that way. That indeed there's a moth that now. I don't know if you're familiar with this moth. That the moth, what happens is over the last century, because of dirt pollution, so they have this camouflage strategy, right? I think it was white, because the tree barks were white. Well, then the tree barks, over the course of about a century, because of continual pollution, the tree bark started to go black and dark. Well, guess what? In a very short order, the moth changed their color. So within the frame of about a century now, these moths, which were white in their environment, are now black. So my point is, this idea of trial and error leading to this design. It's just, the complexity, even the notion of our minds, right? Think about the complexity of this, right? And the complexity of organs. Again, if it was really just matter and energy moving randomly, nature would be much, much simpler. Nature will be much, much simpler. This is just too evolved, too complicated. The engineering principles are in many ways fascinating and breakthroughs.
No, nature is really complicated. Yeah, I think what you're missing, George, is that nature is really, really, really complicated. Nature is probably more complicated than our brains, if you could imagine that. Our brains are really vast.
Okay.
So nature is really, 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 really complicated. And I think what you need to admit is that your use of the word intelligence is a metaphor.
But you just said that nature's more complicated than our brains. That's a very, very far.
Yeah.
Having said that,
you think that's controversial, David? Do you think that's controversial?
The greatest complexity of us is actually thinking. So you said nature is more intelligent.
The greatest complexity of us is no match for the rest of nature. We are part of nature.
Let's not get lost in that. Let me just finish. Let me respond to James. Let me respond to James, which is that. The notion of intelligence. I don't know how else to put it. Again, maybe there's some other language that you're comfortable with.
Order. Just use the word order.
No.
There's an order here.
I'm just trying to say what I'm
or
really
ascending
rejecting,
order or something.
What I know Derek has his hand up. I'm just going to say this and that's going to move on. What I'm rejecting and cannot be sustained logically is that this is just a random energy and matter. It cannot be that.
I agree. Yeah. It's something very, very complex. Sorry,
Derek. Go ahead, brother.
But this is an argument that's, argument is very well known. I'm very happy that James made the point that squirrels, that 90% of them die perhaps and 10% go on to breed with the right kind of ears. And this is a kind of selective process which motivates, evolution. But I think that intelligent design, in my view, makes the same kind of mistake that Hegel makes, of positing some underlying force that is driving the whole of life. Now, I think the idea of the will to life is mistaken. I don't think there is any, a will to life. I think there is just process. There's chemical, process and mind. And I think, when a deer is chased by a lion, he doesn't think, I'm afraid of death, I have to run. He's just in his genes, lions run.
Okay, but wait a second. Wait a second. Where is this behavior gene that you speak of?
Where is the
Yes,
behavior
where?
gene?
Yes, where's the
I mean-
behavior gene you speak of?
I mean, I'm not a geneticist, but human beings, animals do have genes which do all kinds of things.
No,
I mean,
there's
no, I mean,
behavior
saying no.
gene. There's no
What?
behavior. This is one of the issues
So
that
don't you
came up
believe
with
in
the
genes?
scientists yesterday. Hold on a second.
What?
This is one of the issues that came up yesterday. They fall back on this concept of instinct. And I'm like, okay, where's the instinct gene? Show me this instinct gene.
I mean,
Doesn't exist.
that's what you say. That's but
It's
I
not,
don't.
no, I'm not what I'm saying. That's what it is. There's no
But
instinct gene. I've looked into it. There's no instinct gene.
And the fact is that you can completely modify the lion's behavior by raising one. So if you raise a lion, he will always accept cuddling. He will always respond gently to whoever is responsible for bringing up to anyone in his environment because he always trusts humans to take good care of him.
The point
So
being,
I mean,
the
that
point
is
of
true,
that
but-
is that there's no gene responsible for that lion's behavior. It's only the treatment of that lion by his pride and by Mother Nature that turns him into a mechanical killing machine.
David has his hand up, but there's two
Terms.
things. There's two things. First and foremost, and there's a question. Because I'm going to give you my theory. Then we can proceed from there if you want to. I'm going to give you my theory. Okay. My theory is of the mind and of consciousness and human behavior, etc., is that behavior, or let's talk about memory for a second. The human memory is a function of the absolute, right? That humans create knowledge and this is lodged in the absolute. So then when, children are born, they're accessing that knowledge. So, children are known to prodigiously learn language, to prodigiously adapt to technologies, right, where older people cannot. My argument, again, is the idea that knowledge is lodged in the absolute and future generations tap into that knowledge. I mean, I'd submit that's the same thing for animals. Now, animal behavior is modifiable. Animal behavior does change, and that's part of the evolutionary process. I mean, I was watching this very quickly. I was watching this the other day, this documentary on early humanity. And the point is made, and this is what's theorized, is that dogs came into being because some wolves were smart enough to figure out, hey, if I just hang around the humans, they will simply feed me, and I don't have to go on and hunt. So they were intelligent enough, smart enough to figure out a survival strategy. My argument will be that then that strategy gets lodged in the absolute, and then over time, that interaction between the absolute and genes is what evolves into dogs. Again, it's an argument. It's a theory of the mind, for better or for worse. But again, the idea that instinct or behavior is dictated by genes, there's absolutely zero evidence of that.
So, George, you believe in a substantive absolute, apparently.
Yes.
I'm not sure if Hegel did. David S., you're next.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to interrupt the conversation. Just going to throw in 2 cents, which won't amount to much. Is part of this disagreement somewhat semantical, and that maybe Kant offers a little help in his third critique, but when he examines clearly what we're talking about when we say something has a purpose, and that's a way for us to describe what we see as the intelligent carrying out of something which is, in a sense, for us, foreseen in advance, even if we're looking at the process in the past. We say, oh, that had a purpose. Why are there eyes? To see. But the eyes weren't originally to see, right? They were something, but we call it to see because that is the real sense it makes to us. And we're categorizing it, as always, with our forms of expression and our forms of rational determination. And we do things by seeing them in a time sequence with intent sometimes. And we label, the tree reaches up. We know what we're talking about. We don't think the tree is reaching up. On the other hand, it acts just like it's reaching up. And there's a reason we say that, because it doesn't force me to say the tree processes in a direction vertical to the surface of the earth. We think in purposeful terms. for a reason, because it's about acting. So we'll always have that. But to restrict ourselves, to not see things in purposeful terms, is to not look at nature as purposeful. So when we're looking at things purposefully, are we thinking of them as designed? See what I'm saying? It doesn't bother me to think of nature as functioning purposefully at all. Is the purpose to survive and be repeated, or let's just not get confused. Nature scientists are not going to throw God into the mix and say, and that explains it, because then we don't read that.
Let Derek go. I'm sorry, Derek, go ahead.
I mean, Aristotle defined things in a number of ways, but purpose was one of them. Tables. Tables, they may be made from wood, they have legs, and the purpose of it is to place things on them. Okay, but in our modern frame of thought, we don't define things in terms of purpose. We just define things in terms of their characteristics, and it's a mistake to project the idea of purpose onto a table, because the purpose is not in the table. A table is a human artifact, and the purpose is built into it. It's not something there in the table. It's something that humans see it with when they approach a table.
Isn't that its most important aspect? Yeah.
I think his point is that there's an objective aspect. There's a subjective aspect to being in a relationship with a table, with an object, and with this is the way we are with all of nature, not just with the table. We're always approaching the table from the aspect of our own sighting of it, and our own projecting of our vision of the table and of its potential purposes and its potential limitations and its potential advantages and defects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everything in nature, everything that is built out by us, is always evaluated by us to in language to suit a specific purpose that we express in language about it. So the truth of the thing, the truth of nature is not necessarily in the complex of statements that we make about it. Go ahead, George.
I mean, again,
Derek.
The only thing I can understand from what you're saying is that somehow I'm defective in the way that something psychologically suspect in terms of the way that I'm looking at the world and taking it in. Now, let me say this, which is an interesting question in and of itself. When you think about the laws of physics, okay, now ultimately, I assume you're not going to tell me that the idea that matter and energy, basically behave in predictable patterns, that's not a function of my subjectivity, right? So in other words, the very notion that matter and energy behave in predictable ways, right? That's an intelligence. That's why does matter and energy behave predictably, right? Why not just randomly at all, right? So that speaks to design, to intelligence, right? Now, of course, the laws of physics interact with life forces, interact with just life forces. And again, we get that force is what creates nature, and it's all its complexity. Again, it's a very coherent theory that, mind you, scientists don't even have, but they'll just laugh off because they just reject it out of a dogma.
That's apparently predictable. Apparently, remember you're David Hume. Apparently predictable.
Well, again, we could slice it and dice it more philosophically, but I'm looking at this from a political point of view, and I'm simply saying to you that matter and energy behave predictably. Okay, again, I understand other limits and all that's in that statement. But again, I mean, is that my subjective? Is that my subjective understanding, or is that real?
Labeling it intelligence is a bit of, I'm not sure it's a legitimate move in this game.
Again, why does matter and energy, why do they behave predictably?
It's knowledge achieved by induction.
Sometimes they don't,
Exactly,
sometimes they
yes.
don't.
But when they do, why do they?
Okay, let's first go ahead, David, then Derek, then myself, maybe. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think part of it is because we paid attention to them, and part of it is we see what falls into order, because space and time are a way of framing everything that's happening. And that's the only part of the universe we can possibly make sense of. Dark matter doesn't make any sense yet. until it conforms to the things we can see with our forms of understanding.
Well, wait a second. Let's put this concretely. Before, I know you guys want to respond. Why are we on the internet now? How is it possible that we're on the internet now, right? How is it possible that we buy computers and they start and they work and they operate properly? How is it that cell phones out? Again, because matter and energy behave predictably. Why does that happen?
I don't know if that's correct. Just because something is apparently complex doesn't mean it's not chance.
What's amazing is that when analytic philosophers, you confront them with evidence, they are just not going to move. I mean, it's just like whatever, you can't even move. Again, I show you how matter and energy behave predictably and how this is not really there. It's suggestive of unintelligence. It's all of a sudden gobbledygook.
I think it's okay as long as the speed of light and the fine constant, as long as they remain the same, it'll work. In a couple seconds, after it changes, it's all over.
I think it's good if you can have a conversation. I think it's good if you have a conversation and don't go off, George. Stephen, I'd like it if you could raise your hand when you want to speak, but your good comments. Go ahead, Derek, you're next.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've forgotten what I've got to say now, but certainly, I mean, would be opposed to the notion of intelligent design, but I do see a similar theme in Hegel, this underlying force, a metaphysic that I think is corrupting our thought, and with regards to science, I mean, science isn't just, physicalist. It's often, it has a epistemological bias. It sees things in a certain kind of way. It doesn't accept different kinds of reason, doesn't accept different kinds of logic. I mean, for example, I'll give you just one little story. Frank Jackson's story of Mary. Mary is a very intelligent, the most intelligent, researcher on sight and color. Now, Mary is a colorblind. She knows everything about color there is to know, but she's colorblind. Then one day she is able to see color. I mean, does she learn anything? I think she does. She has this aesthetic, experience about color in which she learns something. Now, scientists would want to say, no, she doesn't learn anything. I don't think it's a physicalist, spiritual divide. The divide is much more, entrenched than that. It's much more, complex than that.
So I'm next. I just wanted to say my only objection, besides the force of maybe the force of argument for not but it's the inappropriate use of words, like the idea that these things have a I forget what we were talking about. What you were talking about, it was the force, the matter, the fact that energy has laws and so forth, and that we can contribute predictability. And the fact that we contribute predictability doesn't necessarily yield up all the synonyms that you're using. The intelligence, what it does yield up is the notion of reliability and things like that. So we can attribute to some aspect of nature these things. We can also attribute the unknown to a lot of nature, and we can attribute the unexplained to parts of nature. So you can't win an argument, just like with an example. I think that's my main consideration there. Go ahead, George.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying, I know I used the word, and again, it's an unfortunate language. I used the word in design, and again, it's not design. I mean, again, what it is, it's a dialectic between matter, energy, and the absolute, and that's what is steering this evolutionary process. Now, I'm not trying to over-argue the point with regard to the laws of physics. All I'm saying is that, one of the fascinating things to me when you talk to physical scientists, especially those that are philosophically inclined, and that story of Mary was given to me yesterday. To be frank with you, I'm still not sure what it all means, but this is the point. is that, you know, when you contemplate the laws of physics, okay, all you're seeing the effects of the laws of physics. So in other words, again, this terms of material realism, that all there is are these 4 dimensions, right, in terms of human experience. And that, again, but the laws of physics are unseen. We see the effects of the laws of physics. I mean, it's similar phenomenon we could consider happiness or sadness, depression, your greed, right? We're seeing the effects of these phenomenon, or we're seeing of again, the absolute interacting with genes, right? So again, there is lots, even in terms of physical scientists, there's a lot unseen. Again, the will to survive. You know, you make appeal to instincts in terms of animals. These are unseen, untouchable phenomena, but yet you observe them all the time, right? So I mean, it's a dogma to try to reduce everything to material explanations. It's also a dogma to say that there's nothing beyond material, because even as physical scientists, you study the unseen in terms of the laws of physics at a minimum.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that was good clarification. I'm still get back to Hegel. What can we say? How do people think that we can think about the absolute? Since this is a big issue with the absolute is a really big issue with analytical critics of Hegel. They say that Hegel is wrong. This is basically the criticism of Schopenhauer, that referring to something as the absolute is incorrect. That there's no that's saying that Hegel was going for absolute substance. What I'm familiar with is the absolute knowledge, absolute spirit, and then the preface, of course, the notion of the absolute as something to look for, basically to compare, as a point of comparison, not as necessarily as a point of, maybe he thought of it as a point of attainment. Maybe he thought it was a criteria of perfection or criteria of universality. So I want to know what people who feel really comfortable, like yourself, George, what is the absolute to you, and how does it interact with the rest of reality, or does it interact with reality at all? Is it only a mental conception?
No. Go ahead, Derek. I'm sorry you had your hand up first. Okay, I think he's on something else. What I'm going to say is, okay, I'm going to go this way. I'm sorry. Did you have your hand up there? Are you saying something?
Yeah. I mean, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd like to say that I don't believe in God, but I think God is perhaps the most significant idea that mankind has ever had. And I think we're talking about what Hegel's notion of the absolute is. I mean, it has seems to me, has the same functions as God, but with special qualifications. It is, the thing that goes through all the cosmos and is working itself out in the world. So, I mean, to me, the God is a very useful idea to explain things. And in comparison to Hegel's absolute spirit, it seems to be a useful notion here.
Let me say this, okay? So Hegel is a secular philosopher, in my view. I mean, he makes reference to God, this and that, but again, he's a secular philosopher. Otherwise, he wouldn't be worth talking about, in my estimation. In the main, he's a secular philosopher. Now, let me say this, okay? Let me give you my background in terms of how I came to Hegel, and hopefully that'll give us a better understanding, at least in terms of as I understand Hegel. I'm a social scientist, okay? So I'm looking at Star Trek. Okay, and I'm trying to wonder, okay, what's the appeal of Star Trek? Here we're looking at a platform that's been around, by the time I'm writing, close to 50 years. And there's been other sci-fi shows and they all fail, this and that, okay? And so I came to the conclusion that the popularity of Star Trek is the idea of enduring justice, some enduring conception of justice that transcends time and space. Then let me look at it even more broadly, historically, and more ontologically, which is that if you look at, and this is drawing on Marx and Hegel himself in part, Marx and Hegel, but again, my take on it, is that you see the movement of society from tribal society to feudal society to slave society. I'm sorry, from tribal to slave to feudal to what we conceptualize as modern. Now, this is a modern, I mean, this is a collective, this is collective, right? So the very notion of justice collectively changes, right? So the idea of slavery prior to the American Revolution is acceptable. After slavery, all of a sudden, slavery is no longer acceptable. And it leads ultimately to the American Civil War. So again, I'm looking at collective shifts in human reasoning. And again, collective shifts of justice. What constitutes justice? And so again, the only way I can make sense of this, I start going towards Hegel, the only way I can make sense of it is by looking at Hegel, right? So that, humans, what I argue is that humans and the absolute have something of a distinct, unique interaction because, not only does the absolute change humans, but humans change the absolute. So again, when humans collectively are shifting to new conceptions of justice and fairness, right? They're changing the absolute in the process, right? And so whereas, one time in human history, emperors, absolutes, monarchs were perfectly natural, perfectly normal. Today, they're not, right? So again, I'm trying to understand human civilization, these broad shifts that are permanent. By all intents and purposes, they're permanent. How can we understand that except by referring to this fifth dimension where normative values are embedded, right? And again, notions of justice, notions of fairness, notions of equality, right? We can only understand human society by referencing these enduring values that are manifest in popular culture, And so again, I look at this primarily from a political point of view. I come at it secondarily in terms of evolution. I mean, I have some ideas, et cetera, and so forth, but I look at this primarily as a political phenomenon in terms of understanding human civilization and human politics. I hope that helps in some way.
Yeah, I think so. It reminds me a little bit of Kant's view of morality in the second critique. It's kind of like that the morality is undetermined. It's not determined directly, but everything in morality is influenced by the will of man. So that taken more from an individual perspective, more from an ethical practice perspective in Kant's critique of practical reason, which means ethics essentially. It's kind of to me it's just an extension of that, the idea that there's got to be some reason for justice to be practiced among humans. And if justice is practiced among species, if you have species that practice justice, then the potentiality for absolute justice could maybe emerge. But I'm not sure if you were really going that, George, because you didn't say that word. You didn't answer the question with the word that I was referring to in the question. You didn't say absolute justice. You just said there is a kind of like an emerging justice. So the absolute in terms of, I think it's going there. You said there's absolutes in terms of things that are emergent. And that's what you meant. Then we're on the page. As far as the word goes, it's just that when you use the word, it bears some preparation and even in the text, in the phenomenology, he's always using it as an adjective. He's not using it as, it's only in the preface where he uses it as a noun. And it's just this ability that German has to replace nouns with adjectives and things like that. So I think it's a little looser in German than it is in English. So that's where you got me confused there.
I mean, I would say that justice, and I know some people have their hand up, but just very quickly, absolute conception of justice, classless society free of ethic and gender biases. So there's a telos moving towards that. And we see this in Star Trek, a modern classless society free of ethic and gender biases, right? That telos, philosophy of the right? Or, philosophy of history, right? Moving forward, progressing towards that end. Sorry, other people have their hand up.
Thanks.
I mean,
that's Stephen's next.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say on the problem of induction, George was bringing up some issues, but there's a big problem with this, and I think that sort of generates from something from the Humean argument. Now, you can imagine, for example, let's say there was a planet which had roulette tables, was a copy of the Earth, and yet throughout its entire history, the roulette wheels had always come up red, even though they were just like roulette wheels here. Now, according to the science of possibility or probability or whatever it is, that's possible. It's possible for the roulette wheels to always come up red. And this is a point that Hume would make in another way. But would the scientists of that world be convinced that it's a law that the roulette wheel always comes up red? But we could argue, no, it's just sheer chance that invariably throughout history they've come up red. If you could imagine a whole load of alternate Earths, parallel Earths, almost an infinite number, there would be quite a number of these Earths where the roulette wheels had always come up red, but half of them are going to be black in the next turn. That's the problem with induction and probability.
Just a quick aside before Derek goes. In poker, the chances of getting aces is 1 out of 1,084 hands, and I have received aces 3 hands in a row. So, in other words, the absurdity of contradictory odds is so possible.
Well,
Go ahead, Derek.
either it's just probability or there is a God.
You mean somebody in charge of order, you know? Yeah.
You did something right and they gave you a few good
I
hands.
know, because I took Pascal's wager. I won. Yeah, thank you, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, Hume has got a lot to teach us, and I think we should all be very much, apprised of Hume's distinctions. In explaining human life and evolution, I mean, there's a whole load of competing theories, right? A genetic one, a sociological one, a socio-biological one, a absolute one. But why should, absolutism, the Hegel absolute spirit or intelligent design, it has to compete with these other theories. In my view, it doesn't do very well. There's so many ways to explain human life and society. I mean, people like, Peter Berger give us social structures. I mean, we can explain ethics in terms of social structure. For example, an idea taken from Peter Berger. We all agree that we don't want to have things, stolen from us. We don't want to be murdered. So we all, agree on that. Okay, so we all, agree. And so it becomes something that we, agree on. But because we all, agree, it becomes, objectified. It becomes something solidified in our minds. It becomes like a sin, a law or something. And then that becomes, internalized. So we don't do it. We start off with pragmatic reasons. It becomes an absolute law, within us. So there's all these many ways of explaining, a human life, and intelligent design or an absolute that's feeding its way through, society, to me, comes at the bottom of the list.
Do you have any evidence that people have agreed not to murder each other? Do you have any evidence of this? That comes with the product. Do you have any evidence for the process that you've just described?
Yeah, there's
so much. Do you have any evidence?
You are you're a sociologist. There's sociology books. Just take them off the shelves. So
you have no evidence.
What?
So you have no evidence. That's what it comes down to. You have no evidence.
Well, there's just so much. There's wealth. I'm embarrassed by the wealth of evidence.
George, I find you being really argumentative, and you should put your hand up, if you want to present something that's contradictory.
David stepped away. I'm sorry.
Yeah, David did step away. It's true, but you spoke up first, then David stepped away. Hey, David's next. Okay.
No, I'm in the kitchen. I'm listening to everything, and the spaghetti's about to be ready. So I just want to say, apart from evidence, Derek, that I disagree at a fundamental level with the idea that you have some worthwhile information about the metaphysics of morality that has anything to do with biology and evolutionary history in any way, because I think it has to do with rationality, and that is actually the transcendence of physical conditions, with the recognition of physical conditions, and saying everyone thought this all along and they all voted that it's moral. They're wrong. I think you can actually say it is not a matter of consensus or social conformity. It's a matter of rationality. Hegel goes for that. Kant went for that. I have a really different opinion from the idea that it's a genetic issue.
I mean, I'd just quickly like to answer that. I would like to, I do, agree with you. I'm talking about human action, not about morals. Perhaps there is very little moral action, in the world. It's largely social and psychologically and genetically, impelled. But I would go further than you. It's more than rational. I think there are forces at work here within the possible moral realm that are not rational, but they are structures of a consciousness.
Okay, I just want to interject one term into that discussion, and that's historical complexity. In other words, there's a complexity of forms and influences at work in determining human behavior, not just a sense of justice, not just moral force, and so forth. Go ahead, George.
Well, I mean, just, in part responding to Steve's comment about induction, I mean, again, it's a dogma because, again, what he's doing, he's comparing the behavior of matter and energy to humans, right? So, again, it's I keep, I'm sorry, but, I keep running up against dogmas, which is to say that, okay, we're going to compare human behavior to matter and energy, right? Completely different phenomenon, completely ontologically different, okay? So when I'm talking about, and we're looking at human history, and we're looking at these broad shifts of conception and justice, right? Again, tribal, slave, feudal, modern, right? Again, we're not talking about matter and energy, we're talking about human. So there's this collective shift, right, that we're seeing throughout human history. And again, like one of the most fascinating things, you look at the feudal era, I mean, the feudal era was persistent, not in every single place, but in many different places in the world, more or less in similar timeframes. So that's a fascinating phenomenon, right? And so again, I just point to that just by way of example, right? So again, we're looking at the question of, the idea that humans, I mean, are you telling me, Derek, that the only reason you don't go kill somebody is because there's some secret pact that have been made? I mean, what's interesting and what's fascinating to me about this is that, again, scientists will say, oh, there's only material reality. But then when you talk about the behavior of animals, they appeal to instinct, right? Again, that's not material. Right. So, again, I really do believe that, sadly, I think a lot of the debate outside of Hegelian thought is really driven by pure dogma.
Oh, okay, I got it, George. But it's getting confusing when you relate this discussion with dogma to the current discussion. Because you were the one that introduced. You've introduced a lot of terms in the discussion, like matter and energy and things like that. And I don't think anyone was really necessarily going to go there, but you introduced the terminology, and some people, followed you, like Derek, and it's not necessarily when people talk about matter and energy, they're not necessarily talking about a dogma. Maybe you feel like any talk about genetics is dogmatic, but when we talk about genetics, we're just simply trying to relate genetic theory, or the theory about the consequences of genetics to on differentiation of species and differentiation of types of traits, and possibly types of behavior. And that's where you get into this idea of instinct, right? Where which is an old idea, right? The idea that animals are not actually, don't have nervous, it sort of belies the idea that animals have a nervous system, which is in some ways similar to humans and other higher primates that have to evolve their behavior from the behavior of the groups that they belong to and so forth. Go ahead, George.
I'm simply saying that any reference to genes in behavior, that's a dogma. That's a dogma, right?
I just don't believe in, yeah.
There's
genes in
no
behavior.
behavior. There's the instinct gene in lions. There's the instinct, nothing like that. Nothing, not even remotely. But yeah,
Well, okay, there's simplifications, I'll admit. Once again, they're oversimplifications. But genes, I don't think you were condemning genes. You were condemning the relationship of genes to behavior, right? Okay, so just to be clear, the idea that genes can influence behavior, okay,
the idea that genes dictate behavior.
Right, got it. Okay.
Even influence, you're conceding my point. Okay, because then there's something beyond genes, and that's what I'm saying. There's something beyond genes. I don't deny that genes can influence behavior. I'm simply saying that it's a dialectical process between genes and the absolute. And so any partial explanation on your part opens the door to my argument. And part of the issue that I have, and I know all of you have your hand up, I was going to say this. Part of the issue that I have is that you're trying to use materialist explanations to cut off debate. Say, okay, George, everything can be explained by material, so hence your reference to the absolute is invalid.
Who are you? George, you need to specify who you're talking to. If you're talking to me, who spoke last, I'm just simply, I'm saying there's not that much of a debate here. There's this kind of like insistence that certain things are dogmatic, and that, but then I've argued, for the complexity, and then now you're arguing for the complexity, and now you're addressing me as, so.
I don't know what you mean exactly by complexity. Could you define complexity?
I meant the same thing you did, George. I meant the same thing you did. I meant that there's not a single process at work that determines behavior, that term you introduced. Go ahead, Derek.
Okay, so the standard debate here is between nature and nurture. Also, all sociologists are concerned with that. They're not so much concerned with the absolute. So, I mean, you have to get to grips with the standard debate first, I think, of nature and nurture and all the others.
I hate that debate. Who's next to speak? I got David, Stephen, and Derek. Do you want to go in that order? That sounds right. David, can you talk now?
Right. I thought I had lowered my hand because I didn't want to argue about probability on roulette tables. Sorry. No.
Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we've got some broad areas. Hume was one aspect of the area that was leading up to this. That's Hume's skepticism. On the other hand, we had the area of Copernicus and Galileo, which culminated with Newton, and that's more or less that whole mechanistic view of the universe showed up as a threat to the set of values which prevailed in the church and general thought at the time. But Hume was on another angle. Hume was arguing that possibly our ability actually to know anything at all is suspect, and this was an attack on reason. So this is what's taken us up to where we are with Kant and Hume. And so George seems to have been arguing for the rationalist point of view, more or less the Descartes point of view. If we see certain things happen, then we know what is behind it by induction. But I just express a doubt there, and that's where we've been going. So we're arguing around these areas which are behind where we've come to with Hegel.
Okay, good. That's a good point, Derek.
No, I didn't really have my hand up, but
okay.
If you want me to think of something,
that's fine. That's fine. I misinterpreted it. I guess okay. George has his hand up now.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is, Stephen, for instance, I mean, you want to call it inductive reasoning, okay? But look, we see again, like for instance, wrote a book recently, and hopefully it'll get published. I got a contract on it. Where I point out that you look at the late 60s, and just looking at this example, okay, you look at the late 60s in the United States, and you see in 1968, you see a rabid, racist segregationist, George Wallace, okay? He won, in terms of the 1968 presidential election, he won 5 Deep South states, okay? If you want to know what they are, they're very easily South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, okay? So in 68, he wins 5 states. 10 years later, right, because I grew up in this period, right, the idea of openly discussing racism, the idea of openly using the N-word, I mean, that's just going to get you nowhere, right? That's a dead end, right? And I grew up in the Deep South, okay? And so the point is that, again, we're seeing shifts in human reasoning, in human beliefs, even in narrow time frames. I mean, that's really, I'll even say this about Hegel. Let's relate this to Hegel. That's very quickly, okay? Hegel comes to his theory of history because of the following. He straddles the period of the Napoleonic era in Germany, right? So prior to Napoleon, he's saying, look, people speak of the Kaiser as the sovereign, as the embodiment of the government, right? He's as the embodiment of all political power. Then after Napoleon, right, even the Kaiser has to speak of a more abstract state, something related that is invested in the community and society, right? So he's observing, in his lifetime, he's observing this radical shift in thinking and reasoning, right? And again, he's saying, and I'm saying, that again, one part of the explanation is simply that people's objective conceptions of justice and fairness and the role of government simply have profoundly changed. They've changed objectively, right? And so again, he starts to reference the absolute, and then he starts to think about the shift from tribal society to slave society to feudal to modern. And again, you get the Hegelian telos, right? And so again, I mean, you're all evading this. This gigantic shift that we see in human reasoning, right? And instead you want to turn the discussion to something else, something that's not really relevant.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, let me go out of order because nobody has their hand up, but I think a lot of us relate our view of what you're talking about, the Hegelian telos, to Marx. So because we filter our view of the Hegelian telos through Marx, and the idea that the society is changing in unexpected ways, and that the revolutionary nature of society causes disruptions, and we believe that the contradictions, which were well observed, at least in some respects they were observed by Hegel, but that the general theory of Hegel, that these things all have a purpose and will continue to evolve in their purpose, and the purpose is already sort of like well suited to the machine that gave it birth. And there's a widespread kind of like unrest in society, which is not answered by that telos. So there's this kind of contradiction between Hegel and Marx that lies unresolved for a lot of people. So that's my kind of comment on that, is that there's an unresolved contradiction that in the human psyche between this idea of a society with institutions such as justice that are built to purpose, and the idea that there's an inherent contradiction that will cause the destruction of that could cause the very destruction of the society itself. David.
Yeah, so I'd like to try to, you wouldn't call it resurrect, just save Hegel. That's, religiously, I'll save it. I'm going to try, because in a sense, as a philosopher and not as a politician, he's a theorist, and he's an examiner of thought and consciousness as well as history. And so he's an academic to a degree, we have to look at him that way. And that, of course, his point of view is restricted to the science of the time, the degree of history that was, knowable at that time, and his sources, which were probably vast compared to anything I can imagine. But so the value of his contribution as a theorist, which is to determine that there might be an absolute, and that here's a way to comprehend what that would mean. And that these are the processes that lead to further knowledge, further evolution of society, further evolution of the relations of human beings, of consciousness to each other. And if that constitutes the whole universe, nature and consciousness, if that's everything, then a full comprehension of that, the word absolute, philosophically, I see it sort of meaning something that is not going to change. So as you approach knowing about everything in a general way, you've kind of pinned down certain things for good. And I think George is saying that. Once you've seen slavery and evolved past it, if you haven't killed everyone off with that memory, that is now a part of the evolution permanently. That stake is down. We can talk about it and refer to the problem of slavery, not the good of slavery. And anyone who comes in with the good of it, you look over and say, evolve, please, learn history, right? Because it's absolutely, except some people we allow to say whatever they want. But I'll just finish saying, don't we see an evolution in mathematics? Don't we see a progression forward that you don't have to go back, and you can go back to a question and find new tracks, but you don't erase what's actually standing, you add new tracks. So if you see spirit as, well, I've looked at God as it relates to humans, I looked at religion as it relates to humans, I looked at social structures of different kinds. Can we imagine anything else a priori? Those are all the configurations. There is spirit. So in that sense, he might be a good theoretician without being accurate historically from his particular limited point of view, offering us at all times something that makes sense, unless we find new configurations of intelligence like Star Trek, which proposes innumerable worlds where there's plenty of capacity for everything. And, the Earth could be like that, but it's not our world. But if it were like that, what is the philosophical spirit dimension of that? So that's all. I hope I brought him back a little bit.
No, he was looking at a world in upheaval, and he was seeing that institutions would survive nevertheless. That's good. George, then Derek, then Stephen, I guess.
Again, I'm not, I hate to think that you're really deflecting from what I'm saying. Again, and I'm looking at this not so much as a philosophical question. I'm looking at it simply as an empirical one. And it does touch upon what David said. In other words, why do these conceptions of justice change? Right? When they're collective in nature, right? It's not just, they change in this part of the world or that. Again, these changes are collective in nature. Of course, the more interactions, the more infrastructure connections that we have around the world, the more the changes, of course, then move along those conduits. But nonetheless, the changes are collective, right? And so again, how do you explain that? How do you explain that from a social science point of view? Other than referring to a fifth dimension, where things change there and then it affects human reasoning.
That's interesting. George, you're talking as if we're all interested by saying that we're reflecting from your argument. You're saying that, that there's something wrong with that. Maybe no one's interested in your argument. That's a possibility. Derek, then Stephen.
The point is empirical fact.
The thing is,
okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Derek.
Okay, yeah. We can. George, you say, how do we explain the change of the concept of justice without some, absolute? We can explain it very easily by the sociology of, ideas, of pragmatics, of physical circumstances. It would take a long time to go into all those. But I think the question we're asking I think we should be asking is, how well does Hegel explain the evolution, the progression of humankind, And okay, we have the progression of humankind on one side, and we have a theory on the other side. We can match up the two. one of my problems is I find a lot of ideas in Hegel that are very problematic. So I suspect, things like the absolute, for example, or the absolute working through nature, or absolute self-consciousness, or pure self-consciousness, I think. And the notion of a purpose in things. I mean, to me, there are huge philosophical problems with Hegelian thought. So, I mean, he's standing on water, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, okay, there are very interesting things here. I mean, he was a very clever guy, and I've hardly read his work. But from what I've read, I mean, one can mount a huge critique of his work.
Stephen? Stephen, you're next. You have your hand up.
I'm just questioning this whole, modernist justice approach to the idea of slavery. I believe slavery will most likely return. I would say it's a particular set of circumstances which led to the abandonment of slavery. And as soon as another particular set of circumstances arise that suits it, slavery will be revived. So I just don't see anything implicitly moral in the natural order.
Well,
I can't see that.
David?
Go ahead, David.
David, then you, George.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. So, George, you were asking about how can we explain, and Derek sort of answered, how can we explain progress without a fifth dimensional, a quintessence, some element to come in and be the explanation. I think it's a question of learning more about consciousness, and that how consciousness assimilates new information. I think Hegel is a starting point for understanding consciousness from the phenomenological point of view, the experiential point of view, and that scientists, could learn a lot by taking him seriously, and that the fact that Marx took something out of this and applied, maybe the first 150 pages to the idea that, history should be looked at in this way, only we should be looking at the material, not the consciousness of history. And it's the material that is the truth of history. And so that is a refinement of what we should be looking at, maybe in terms of looking at social structures and answering Stephen's questions. What are the conditions for slavery? But maybe the precondition of knowing about slavery affects the question of whether slavery can arise. And I think having a past with slavery is a subjective condition. But Hegel's suggesting that there is an objective result of having that knowledge, having that experience in consciousness. And for two people to stand in the same room, and for one to know what that means and the other to not know what that means, there's a conflict. And if the one who doesn't know kills the one who knows, yes, we'll have slavery again, clearly. But that's not an advance of spirit. You can always get sick and die. You can always go backwards, but we're talking about developing. So if we let humanity not kill itself, is there a progression of spirit? I think that's a question that I think is very important. And what does it mean to progress? I think this is a way to talk about this, very important. Knowing your past in these terms could be very helpful. And it also, I think, opens up ideas about how sociology should think. And I'm not going Marxist on you, but I mean, there's one attempt that brings something true, the objective physical world. Is it Hegel who said it's not the philosophers and thinkers who are determining history? It's the actual world happening, and this is the real history. And don't think that Voltaire or somebody, in a tower is, really the Geist. It's what's going on the ground. That's what's going to be the revolution, I think. It's not, we have advanced ideas when this democracy was started, but we didn't really live those ideas in certain ways. And we have to develop And it's a forward thing. It's a really, I think, looking at it as a development and as a force behind it, which is once you've learned something, you have theorems you can apply. That's a force towards more knowledge. I think there's a force in Hegelian development.
Well, I mean, I don't. We're actually in agreement. I think there is something of a force. Now, the other side to it is, I agree that humans, right? I said this earlier. That humans affect the absolute, and it goes in two directions. It's a dialectical process, right? Hegel is famous again for understanding everything dialectically, and I happen to 100% agree with him. Okay. Now, Stephen, again, it's not a negation. I mean, to say that we can go back. Now, we can debate this, okay? But it still doesn't mean that there hasn't been a shift in public thinking, in public reasoning, right? And what I look at, and I look at as evidence of, again, what is the spirit of love? What is the spirit of justice? And I'm a social scientist, political scientist. That's really what I'm interested in. What's the spirit of justice? How to define the spirit of justice? What I do is I look at popular culture, right? And in Star Trek, I see a one theory of justice, and I see it, then I say its popularity is precisely because it is communicating to us in an artistic but nonetheless intelligible way. It's communicating to us the conception of justice that adheres within the absolute, right? So this is, Star Trek is proof positive, A, of the absolute, B, of the notion of objective justice, and C, that popular culture, it transmits the spirits to us in an intelligible way, right? And again, simply the idea that we can go back doesn't mean that there hasn't been a shift forward. It just means for some reason there's been a shift back, which we can talk about and analyze, right? But again, I say this, and what I'm going to say is broadly, and I don't mean this at anybody. What I find in general is that there is this intuitive, knee-jerk hostility to pointing to anything that is super sensible in terms of in reality, right? So as long as I start saying super, no, it's all material, and people will make reference to things that are not material, and they don't even realize that, again, referring to instinct or this and that. And so again, there's the dogma of genes. So I'm simply saying is that, and again, this is what I say, this is what I'm going to talk about on Friday. I say the mistake in our thinking is this dichotomy of our metaphysics, which is on the one hand, it's either analytic philosophy, material realism, or it's religious epistemology, right? I mean, that's a fundamental error because it leads right-thinking people to cling to an argument in material reality and material realism that simply is unsustainable. It is simply unsustainable. It is a contradictory. It makes no sense, material realism, for humans to argue material realism. With mind, we have mind, again, material realism doesn't even have a theory of the mind. But yet you have material realists saying, oh, no, there's only material that exists. And I even say this, and I'm going to end right now. I'm going to cede the floor right now and say, I realistically, I come here and we open the dialogue and I'm very open to the spirit of everybody's arguments. But really, what I tell my students is I have a real hard time discussing philosophy with analytic philosophers when they don't even have a theory of their own mind. What's the point of having a conversation with someone that doesn't even have a theory of their own mind? So I'll cede the floor on that.
Okay. Yeah, just a tip to you, George, when you do your explication, to do define your terms, define religious epistemology and define analytic philosophy for the listeners, because some of us are kind of like we get a little bit suspicious when you say this is the main debate and you don't really clarify that, because that's how you started the argument, and then you started like, yeah. So that's when you're doing your presentation. That's really important. The thing I wanted to talk about, I really liked what a lot of people had to say tonight. I think my notion is that freedom is concrete. So I think what a lot of people might miss in Hegel, what's important to me in Hegel is that freedom is concrete, and that not so much that that there's a worthiness or a tendency or something that's value in the absolute, but that the notion of freedom is always at work. This is really according to my understanding of science. In other words, I have some knowledge of science, and I follow a lot of scientific directions and areas, and everything from electronics to medicine, and so forth, like a lot of other people, and physics. And I definitely have the impression that freedom is at work in all of this, in all of these areas. That freedom is a constituent of existence, and or reality, if you will. So, and I don't take a hard line on, about reality. I just have a definition of reality. I understand that reality is at work in existence, and that reality is something that is beyond the sensible. It's something that can be defined by it can be defined by as that which is in existence without our necessarily having to experience it. And something that really influences our experience in complex and indirect ways. So that's my point of view. And after reading Hegel, and that the big issue for me is how freedom influences all of these forces that are work in society, in ourselves. And when I talk about my mind, I'm talking about myself. So if I talk about my sore toe, that's only part of my nervous system at work there. So, but it's myself that is really at stake for me. So, go ahead, Derek, and then Stephen.
I'll just make a brief. I mean, George, when you're speaking about scientists, you sound like you're speaking to the positivists, to dogmatic, positivists of the 19th century, which are very few about, today. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do speak to them occasionally, but they're in the minority, and it's certainly, I don't think you'll find any in this room. Okay. The whole notion of justice. I mean, it's nice to think that it's an absolute, but I mean, I personally think it's there's something behind it. But I think the concept, the particular content of justice, is a human artifact. It's a product of society. And who was it? I think Hobbes said that justice was nonsense on stilts. I do think there's something rather, nonsensical about it. That it's something we want, and we simply, objectify it. This is justice, or what I think of as a justice. There's a very, James was talking about his foundations there. I mean, I'd like to talk about mine, but I won't. But I think that there is a foundation, a subjective foundation. Freedom, I think, is a contentious idea. A lot of people, Hegel and the existentialists and the postmodernists, have taken up the idea of freedom. I think it is a precondition of certain things, but I don't know whether we can, adopt it as a principle in a straightforward way.
Okay, Stephen, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, I probably, in arguing about knowledge, I just have this enormous problem with the enthusiasm and pride which an intellectual will argue human knowledge. Now, it just might come down to it that human knowledge is a little speck about that big. There could be beings, for example, far in advance of us that put us on the level of the animal, or even, the plant, for all I know. So I always find it suspect that human beings argue from this point where they feel that they've got some sort of absolute knowledge. I think it was argued in mathematics that we might have reached an absolute knowledge, but then there are people that doubted that. So I'm just wary of constantly hearing this prideful argument. The wonders, the enthusiasm for human knowledge, when it could be only something that big.
Okay. Then George.
Thank you. On this question of justice and the idea that, I don't know if lack of a better phrase, the poo-pooing of the idea of justice. I mean, when you think about human history, okay, and let's start with let's say the American Revolution, right? Where you had people in the US just saying, you know what? This is no longer just for us. We reject the monarchy and we're going to risk our lives and we're going to fight this horrific war to defeat the strongest military in the world. And lots of Americans died and lots of people died simply fighting and dying for this concept of justice. And then the idea of all men are created equal, this has a profound global effect, right? In terms of the French Revolution and it changes the 19th and 20th centuries can really only be understood by that concept of justice, which was at the core of the American Revolution, and that is all men are created equal. And then you look at the Civil War, where Northern soldiers. I mean, you know what one of the ironies is that the view, and this is not trying to indict you in any way, Derek, but the view that Derek puts forward, and again, I almost want to say it's a cynical view, which is that people don't fight for justice. Justice is just subjective, right? They talk justice, but no one really fights for it. I mean, that's the cynicism of the British in the American Revolutionary War. That's the cynicism of the Southern slaveocracy. Northerners are never going to fight and die to free African Americans, right? But yet Union soldiers in the hundreds of thousands died. Union soldiers amputated hundreds of millions of people, right, to defeat the slaveocracy. Again, Hitler thought, Americans, they're never going to fight for justice. People only fight for blood and soil, right? Justice is not real, right? But yet Americans, right, they fought World War II. Millions of Americans left their families and fought and died and got injured, etc. Look at the Vietnamese in terms of, again, the American military people. The Vietnamese, they're going to see our firepower and they're just going to give up, right? So yeah, this idea that justice is this sort of fungible thing, which really is just people talk about it every once in a while. Again, we can't understand human history. We can't understand the 20th and 21st centuries absent justice, the conception of justice, and discussing and debating what is justice and why is it so important, right? And why are people so compelled? They're compelled to die, to literally kill themselves for justice, right? We can't just simply dismiss it. In terms of, again, just looking at human history. As an empirical point, we can't dismiss it.
I'm always looking for contrary points of view. I really want to read your book, George. Thank you. Go ahead, Derek.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I agree with you. Justice is a tremendously important idea in human life and history. It's just that I think it's philosophically suspect. I mean, people have died for the idea of God, but I don't believe in God. I think all these people have died. Perhaps their spirit has expressed something, but just giving all these, it just means that hundreds of thousands of people have believed in something very deeply. It doesn't make it true.
I think it does make it true.
Well, that's suspicious because there's this thing called the fallacy of the majority. So the majoritarian fallacy. In other words, that the fact that we've been working on building a better paperclip for so long, and have been only partly successful. We haven't eliminated the original paperclip. Doesn't mean that human society is worthless.
Does it matter?
Stephen, go.
Liz wants to say something. Liz wants to say something.
She said something. I'm not sure if she wants to say anything else. Go if you want to. Go ahead, Liz.
I just meant, does it matter why justice has been the way that has been in the past? I mean, why is that so important, and what does it have to do with philosophy?
Well, the idea that being that, right, in order to understand why did Union soldiers sacrifice themselves in the hundreds of thousands, right? Why did they sacrifice themselves? Again, they were fighting for something objective, something that was compelling, right? Something that they were willing to die for. And again, this notion of justice. They weren't being offered, they weren't promised anything. They didn't do it for any material reasons. They did it just for justice, right? An important philosophical question. Why did millions of people join the Union Army? I mean, that's a profound philosophical question that, in my opinion, can only be satisfying answer only involves the fifth dimension. I'm not saying that people don't have other answers. I just think that that's most convincing.
Did Hegel pick this up anywhere, George?
Well, Hegel wasn't alive with the Civil War.
Well, I'm just wondering, there are lots of wars prior to Hegel's time and some during Hegel's time. So I'm just wondering if he picked it up in the phenomenology or anywhere.
No. That's his point about Napoleon. That's his point about, before people would fight, right? People would fight because of personal, the armies were much smaller. Battles were much smaller because people would fight out of loyalty to the Lord or loyalty to the king, right? Yeah. But now, post-Napoleon, now people are fighting for the state. Now people are fighting for their community, right? So he's observing this shift and he's saying something fundamental, something concrete has taken place in Prussia. And he's saying that the only way, again, his rational explanation is the absolute has shifted.
He was alive for the revolution.
His philosophy of history, philosophy of the right.
He was alive for the revolution. The revolutionary war. He was alive for the revolutionary war.
He was. That's exactly right.
Uh-huh.
So he's seeing the aftermath of the French Revolution. And he's saying something profoundly has shifted here. People that were behaving one way, had political thoughts one way, now have profoundly different political thoughts in the aftermath of the revolution. And he's saying that cannot be explained simply by material circumstance.
Yeah, I have Stephen next, then Derek.
Stephen?
I have to go, guys. I have to go, okay?
Hey, thanks, George. Lots of good things to think about. Thanks for your contribution.
Hey, man, I want to thank everyone here. You're all wonderful brothers and sisters. I really, really want to thank you so much, okay?
Thanks, George.
Thank you. And join me on Friday. My Amazon list of books is there. I put it in the chat. You can see I've written about 7 books on popular culture. I have another body of thought that deals with energy, politics, global warming. You can ignore that. But I have a whole set of literature on popular culture and philosophy.
Yeah, we also have in the chat. We also have a post by Lucas Potts on Facebook, so it's probably worth reading. Thank you very much, George.
Thank you.
Okay, Stephen, you're next, but I'm sorry you went off.
The issue of slavery, whether we're always progressing. For example, in Germanic or English-speaking culture, in the pagan times, I think about 10% of people were slaves. Slavery is in the form of chattel slavery almost disappeared in the Middle Ages. And yet we come to modern times, we come to the colonization of America, suddenly slavery and the worst form of slavery, chattel slavery, comes back on the large scale. So it returned. This idea of an eternal progression of some form of moral justice, I find a bit suspect. It could be there. I could be wrong. There could be a moral spirit, a spirit of justice, but do we know that for certain?
No, I think your concept is really interesting, Stephen. That the history of slavery and mankind is not necessarily closed. I made this point in a meeting about the meeting was called the Colonization of Mars. So the idea is that some people think that Mars is colonizable simply because there's enough technology to do it. And then secondly, because there might be resources that we can exploit to make it possible on Mars. And then but then there's a third idea, which there are scientists, there exist philosophers, not scientists, philosophers. One of the Texas philosophers, apparently George is a Texas philosopher. They didn't say he wasn't Texan, he says he's from Texas. And there's a Texas philosopher that believes, his name is Schwartz, I believe. He has like one of those highly European sounding names. So he believes that people could actually be exploited on Mars. In other words, the issue might become an exploitation of the people that volunteered to go, because they could be marooned, or they could be. How would sex occur? In other words, would there have to be sexual contracts to make sure that recolonization happened, and so forth. So in other words, so the issue of slavery could reemerge in new forms, and that, I think, in the idea of the colonization of Mars and the difficulties that would be experienced by the people that were sent there to maintain the colonies could be an issue there. Would they be exploited? Would there be instances of would there be issues that in which this idea of slavery reemerges? Because today it's represented, I think, in the issue of sexual slavery, the idea that people create whenever you have, even when you just have free prostitution, you have, the idea that people can use that basically people can have sexual enterprise, and people can have various sexual enterprises. Does that reintroduces the idea of that moralists use that as an opportunity to re-emerge, to reintroduce the idea of sexual freedom. Sexual commerce introduces the idea of sexual exploitation, and sexual slavery, so to speak, and that's the term I like to use. So yeah, slavery is still an issue. It's not closed. It's not a closed book at all.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to say, I think, sorry, were you next?
Yeah. So going to sort of follow up on that. Steve, when you're talking about progress, I think we're kind of naive when we think of it as a straight line, or ascending constantly like a stock market. It's a question of, are there trends that are meaningful, and can you get to one point without passing through other points, right? So just because I'm against slavery, and if I bring up someone and then I don't pass my values on, do these values pass on automatically? No, they don't pass on. If there are separate consciousnesses in the world, because we don't know what it's like to live in Russia, we can't imagine. Then when we meet a Russian and we talk about freedom, like they tell us, your country is so unfree, you don't have free politics, and here we freely elect Putin. I say, well, I don't think we have a similar consciousness, because you can't imagine not voting for that guy. And to me, that isn't what democracy is. You actually have to have the ability to change things, but we have these discussions, and they can prove with objective facts that America is so not free, that I'm just brainwashed by my media. So there's a confusion about what does it mean to assert something about consciousness. Do the Russians understand democracy? They have maybe better regulated elections than we do, but no parties that can compete. Do they understand what I mean? Do two consciousnesses, do they communicate? And Hegel, I think, again, from his ivory tower, where if you don't understand them, you flunk his course, is saying, I'm talking about consciousnesses that can communicate and relate to each other, teach each other, and learn from each other. So when you disjoint, when you make them disjointed, it's like severing a brain. It no longer has the same linguistic and visualizing capabilities. So this is, again, an abstract, to me, philosophy of spirit that does make sense to try to apply, but it's not the prediction of human existence, because we don't know what the arbitrary circumstances will be. And then James just highlighted one extremely, kind of relevant arbitrariness, which is severing part of the human race from its communion with the rest, right?
Yeah, and what could result in terms of the necessities of that separation. That's good way to put it. I just wanted to point out, that one of the problems in the dialogues between Americans and Russians is we have much poorer information about them than they do about us. As a matter of fact, there are many parties in government in Russia, not just the two or three that we have. It's two, three, or four at the most. The Green Party actually gets in. Huh?
But no one seems to get more than 2% against Putin.
No, but they are in the government. So they actually have a government that's composed of more parties. And actually, and it's not 2%. It's some of the parties have 15% and so forth. So we have very poor information here because of our news is so poor. They talk about context. They talk about problems in Russian politics completely out of the context of the reality. It's true. They don't have a two-party system the way we do, and a lot of us are anti-two-party systems. So, the idea that we're supposed to accept the two-party system in America is, I think, one of the most ridiculous political realities that we have. Why don't you, Stephen? We haven't heard from you. We did hear from you. Go ahead, Derek, then Stephen. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, thanks. Yeah. I mean, the idea of a graduated or evolutionary, consciousness is very much accepted in the animal world. It's not so much accepted in the human world, but I think it should be. And if it is, can't we think about different levels of a consciousness in which different things are, important? That it's certain levels of consciousness you are, egoistic, as people like Pareto and other people's held, and then at other levels we are more, aware of the other person, because being conscious of the other, as Hegel seems to imply, is being conscious of oneself. So that, if there's an evolution of a consciousness, which is a contentious idea, then in some sense, perhaps we may never be able to go back to a time when other people are of no consequence, because our consciousness is maintained by a consciousness of other people.
Yeah, there's a bottom line to human consciousness. No, I think that's what in a sense, I think that's what you're saying. And Hegel does say that it's basically because of the others that we become conscious, that we become more conscious of ourselves, we develop self-consciousness. That's great. Stephen?
I was just going to ask, has anybody read the Hegel and Heizi paper by Susan Buck-Moores, which the lecturer pointed to in the lectures associated with this week?
No.
No, yeah, maybe David S. did, but he's just taken off. Okay.